But we focus on catalyzing the bioeconomy. We do a lot of work with SMEs. We're one of the few associations that does direct commercialization. So we have a small fund that we use to support companies in that space where proof of concept has perhaps been identified and confirmed, but there's not revenue yet generating. So we've been at it for a while. We think we're not too bad at doing due diligence and working on development pathways with new and growing bioscience companies. And we've got a very strong and supportive and collegial cluster that's concentrated in Saskatoon. So we're very, very fortunate to be in the situation that we are in. So just focusing on some of these global drivers, some of this is going to seem rather obvious, some maybe less so, but of course we're seem to be moving into an area of stronger free trade, stronger protectionism, less free trade. Of course, climate mitigation and adaptation are big drivers. The commodity super cycle, where are we if this is a real thing? Oil self-sufficiency, and I'm particularly referring to the United States. Big data, what is it, and how can we make some use of it in our space? This trend to sustainability, a growing acceptance of genomics tools, both in the developed world and in the developing world, finally. A renewed focus on biological inputs and the associated research. Investment interests, we're seeing that grow from non-traditional sources. Of course, we're seeing a lot of merger and acquisition happening in big agriculture, so to speak. And we're also seeing consumer power, and that's a function of social media, that consumers do have the power to move markets now. And then, of course, traceability and social license. So protectionism, I guess it doesn't take a rocket scientist to see that we're moving perhaps to an era of bilateral trade agreements. The Americans have walked away from TPP, and whether or not this is a 4-year anomaly or something that's larger. We also see what's happened in the UK with Brexit, and there are some large countries moving to a more protectionist stance. We are big exporters, so obviously there's going to be some implications. In terms of climate mitigation and adaptation, there's multiple demands being placed on agriculture now. And we've got to find that sweet spot, those synergies between productivity and income and mitigation and adaptation. So we're part of that ecosystem, and it's our role to try and push forward what I would call climate smart agriculture. Just a few words on the commodity super cycle. Everybody watches that very closely. Are we at what we might call the end of the trough? Or are we at something else entirely? We're starting to hear hints that perhaps we've hit the trough on this. We haven't felt it to the same extent in Canada, and that's largely due to a 75-cent dollar and its relation to an export market. In terms of oil, OPEC and options for the USA, it's a bit of a new world that we're entering because the Americans, and especially with perhaps a renewed focus on drilling in the U.S. and production, self-sufficiency for the Americans is a big deal. They're the biggest oil users, and that's got implications across the entire world, including agriculture and the bioeconomy. This whole idea of digital agriculture and big data, we're taking baby steps in this space. We're gathering all this data, but do we know how to interpret it? Do we know how to implement it? You talk about where is a growth job in the world that we're moving towards. It's bioinformatics, and I mean, I know in our very own space we're absolutely short of these folks that can interpret and guide us in terms of what is the big data that we have at hand? How do we use it? We've got to start figuring out how to use it. I came across this example, and I just threw it up for interest sakes. Probably most of us have never heard of that. This is a small British company called Cambridge Analytica, and an interesting little report I read on them. They've figured out how to precisely target specific individuals with specific messages, and there are folks that are crediting them with the success of the Brexit vote and the recent U.S. election. So, and they do this all based on studying Facebook likes. So they are an example of when you mine that big data, what kind of power is underlying there, and that has implications for us too. Sustainable production, of course, that's an overriding global theme. Sustainable might be the 21st century overused word. We've got to understand what that means. It's got economic, environmental, and social implications, and that cost-benefit analysis has to be done in a whole variety of fields. The movement of acceptance of genomics tools in the developing world, and the advances, of course, in genomics technologies. There's a whole laundry list of new technologies that we have at hand. You might even argue that regulatory has been challenged to keep up with the tools that we have at hand. There's a lot of things we can do, and actually it's even leading to a lot of ethical questions about what should we do versus what can we do. So happily, some of those greater acceptance in the developing world is going to make a big difference, and we're happy to see that. This whole idea of a renewed research focus on biologicals and microbials and natural products. I'll just put a plug in for a new national center of excellence called Natural Products Canada. We are one of the nodes. We're a Western node, but this has been a collaboration between the first 4 nodes, and it's based out of Prince Edward Island. And Laval in Quebec, and here in Ontario, I believe in Guelph as well. So we're seeing renewed interest in finding ways to bring some of these products of biological and microbial research and a whole host of other things to commercialization quicker. Growing interest from non-traditional investments. In agriculture, in the bioeconomy. We're seeing evidence of that in our space from the Silicon Valley. And these are folks that have very deep pockets. Happily, they seem to have a growing understanding of the patience required in the bioeconomy. And they are going to help us exploit opportunities in terms of growth. So we're very pleased to see that. Mergers and acquisitions, of course, there's a whole host of them in the crop protection world. Monsanto, Bayer, Dow, DuPont, the Syngenta Chinese acquisition, Potash Corp, Agrium, and on they go. And when you see mergers and acquisitions, of course, you can extrapolate from that margins are getting tighter. Folks are believing they need to get larger in order to continue to be profitable. This idea of the consumer power to move markets, we're seeing that in both good ways and bad ways. There's the idea that there's 9 groups of urban consumers are going to generate 75% of that global urban consumption. And there's some big groups in there. Of course, China, the retiring and elderly, and onward and onward. So these folks have the power to move markets, and we've got to be aware of that. And finally, traceability and social license. There's all kinds of organizations that are cropping up in terms of supporting this idea of social license. I think the jury is still out a little bit on the benefit or the value of some of the things that we're doing, but at least we are recognizing that there's challenges there, and we need to make sure discussions are happening. I'll shift gears a little bit, and we'll talk about some of the national drivers. So of course the monetization of carbon, is this going to change production economics? The jury is still out on that. We're in the midst of implementation for that. So time will tell. We're happily seeing a national trend of the Canadian government reinvesting in public research, and in particular, and those are just a couple of shots of Egg Canada and NRC in Saskatoon, but of course this is a trend we're seeing across the country, a reinvestment in public research, and that is critically important in our space to see things move forward. First generation ethanol biodiesel being supplanted by next generation biofeedstocks. Again, that is in terms of sustainability and economic viability, that is critical in our space. The low Canadian dollar. I mentioned Silicon Valley, but there is a underlying driver there as well too, in terms of attracting foreign direct investment and acquisitions. That is a little bit of a double-edged sword, but that low Canadian dollar is also propping up export commodity values. A lot of folks probably don't appreciate our neighbors to the south, for example. They've had a really tough go the last number of years in ag production, and we seem to have been sailing along. Probably the biggest thing we can point to is the benefit of a 75-cent dollar. So what are we producing? Who are we selling to? Little bit of a visual on what we're doing, and you can see that there's still a lot of food products that are paying the bills, and that is the basis of our Canadian ag economy for the time being. And again, doesn't take a rocket scientist to see who our biggest export market is, and that's got some concern around it right now in terms of reliability and predictability in that market. So we do well to continue to try and diversify. This idea of a monoculture approach is a little troubling, and you're hearing more people I know in our space talking about this, especially out west. It's leading to increased disease, pest, and resistance pressure, and primary producers, frankly, are trying to make a go of it financially, and they've narrowed down their rotations a fair bit. That's one piece of it. The other piece of it, if you look at something like canola, for example, there's only a few players left that develop new canola varieties. The germplasm pool is getting smaller and smaller as time goes on, and we do this at our own risk. So certainly, I believe that a greater emphasis on the bioeconomy can help us with looking at this challenge of monoculture. That being said, are Canadian producers making any money? Well, absolutely. This is 2015 numbers. It was around that $15 billion number. Total farm income up over $135,000 a year. So it's been rising steadily. From that perspective, certainly it looks very bright, but again, a double-edged sword for the bioeconomy. They say that necessity is the motherhood of invention sometimes. Primary producers aren't currently necessarily feeling all that necessity in terms of I've got to diversify, I've got to find other sources of income. At the farm gate, things are going not too bad. Again, this is a little bit of a SWOT that is showing some of the trends from the consumer and the market perspective, and innovation and technology trends. And I won't run through all of those because some of these are covered in lots of different ways, but this idea of going to an ingredient approach to the things that we produce is a good trend in terms of adding more value, and we're certainly seeing that versus a raw commodity approach. Diversification was another word that was used over and over to the point that it became meaningless, but I do think that we're seeing some real diversification further up the chain in terms of ingredient development. I'll get into a little bit of the implications here shortly, but one comment I did want to make here is this traditional approach of an opportunistic feedstock to grow the bioproduct economy. I don't think that's going to meet the demand in the long run. And that's particularly true, again, I believe, out west, in that unless we start doing this on purpose, folks are not going to take this as seriously as we would like them to do. The other thing I wanted to point out that we learn over and over is food always rules. And that's in terms of preference for production that's tied to values of the things that you produce. So that is going to be a reality that doesn't change anytime in the near term. Farmland values up very strongly, though it's been easing a little bit more recently. But the takeaway from that is producers need an ever-increasing return on their investment to remain profitable. We're still light years away from other jurisdictions in the world in terms of values, but they are certainly trending in a particular direction. Some of the impacts on projected changes in climate, and this can be good and bad. I've read reports all over the place in terms of what does it mean, particularly for Canada. The net impact is uncertain, but it probably depends a lot on how we adapt, how we mitigate. But there's arguments that in some jurisdictions in Canada, there's going to be net benefits to the changes that we see, in others, not so much. So some of the implications. Good. So I'll run through this quickly and maybe leave you with some takeaways in terms of implications. So I'd indicated that things are profitable at the farm gate. They're currently impressive, but I would really want to stress this. They're also very fragile, and they can easily be blown away in just a few variables changing up. What we do need to do is we do need to learn to diversify in the good times. And if these can be characterized as the good times in Canadian agriculture, this is our prime time to get serious about some of this diversification. Can't always be out of necessity in the tough times. That depreciated value of the Canadian currency is helping to maintain profitability, and that speaks to some of this fragility in terms of profitability. The risk of a Canadian petrodollar liftoff is real. If you believe we went through the trough of a supercycle and things are going to move up, it's good for the oil and gas sector. But if it drives, and I just threw a graph up there, there's pretty strong correlation between the US-Canadian exchange and the price of oil. And if one goes up, the other is quite likely sure to follow. And I'll tell you what, I know in my own part of the world, things would look much, much different if we were dealing with the dollar at par than dealing with a 75-cent dollar. Those rising farmland values, producers do require a fair dollar for all of their outputs, including biomass. And I do believe we need to get more sophisticated with our terminology, even in terms of driving how producers see their opportunity here. Farmland value, we're certainly seeing it out west. We're seeing the march west of beans and corn through Manitoba, now further into Saskatchewan. Some of that is a function of climate, and we're seeing more moisture, and we're seeing more heat, but we're also seeing an investment in research and development from the big players, the big corn and soybean players. Never before, up until about 5 years ago, did they actually set up shop in Western Canada and say, yeah, we're going to develop varieties that fit your heat units and your eco climate. And they're doing that now. I mean, some of the big players have plans for very, very large acres. And it doesn't take, again, a rocket scientist to know that if you can profitably grow corn and soybeans on that ground, land values they've got a long, long way to go up, especially in Western Canada. Consumers. they say they want to go green, they say they want to be sustainable, they say they want to be bio-based, but will they get behind a pull-oriented bioeconomy? Thus far, I'm not convinced, because by and large, the majority of them will pay the least for a product, and that is going to be the primary driver. We did hear about some of the brands getting behind a push-oriented bioeconomy, and I think that is true to an extent with some of the early adopters, but I don't think it's mainstream yet to the extent that it needs to be to truly grow a bioeconomy of substance. This idea of carbon monetization, is it going to be a boon or a bane or a bit of both to the Canadian egg bioeconomy? I would anticipate it may be a mixed bag, but again, it depends so much on what we do with it, and we've got a tremendous capacity to adapt, and we've demonstrated that over and over again, and it's going to take the coordination and the efforts of public and private research. But I do think that we can find ways to turn carbon monetization into a win for Canadian agriculture. And it's more than I think we do. I know we need to do this because it's going to impact profitability. So where are the near-term opportunities that we're seeing? A few of those I've listed there: transforming hemp and flax fiber into biomaterials, automotive and construction industry, and we heard a little bit about that. Purpose-grown crops, switchgrass, miscanthus, other warm season grasses. We're finally starting to do some real research in this space and get enough people interested, I think, to start having a real close look at this. Using bio-based feedstocks to produce bio-based chemicals, and again, we've got some leaders in the room here with us, and we can only hope to see that grow. This idea of powering local communities, using egg biofeedstocks for both bioenergy, and then converting crop oils and the stress industrial oils into biofuels to power road, rail, marine, and air transportation. So some of the other implications I did want to point out. One thing that kind of gets a bird in my bonnet is this idea of using the words waste and residue when we're referring to this stuff, because this just simply cheapens the whole value chain. And it might be good for the one that is trying to acquire so-called cheap feedstock, but in the long run for the whole chain, this is simply not the right approach. Consumers, and when consumers hear these kind of things, they expect to get bioproducts on the cheap. And they're thinking that there is no value there, so why should I be paying up? And it also implies to the producer that somehow they've got to give away parts of their production in order for this thing to be sustainable. It doesn't build trust throughout the whole thing. So I would propose that in the absence of better words, we just simply call it biofeedstock, and try and imply that there truly is some value in there, and then we'll start being taken more seriously. We have some good tools, and folks like Ag Canada have worked on some great tools. I just threw up the BIMAT tool, and I've banged the drum on this a little bit. Ag Canada did some good early work on this. We need to see a lot more work. This is a nice framework, but it could become very valuable in terms of categorizing and quantifying the various supplies of biofeedstock. But right now, the tool I don't think is used as well or as much as it should or could be, because it does need some work and it needs some investment. Again, climate change. Interestingly, I don't know if a lot of folks appreciate that Environment Canada has actually done a lot of work in this space that maybe doesn't get publicized, but I'd invite you to go look on their websites, and they actually have a time lapse on both temperature and precipitation in terms of their best models. I only went up to 2050, but it's a 100-year time lapse model that they have. And whether or not you fully agree with the actual numbers, the trend, I think, is probably not something that you could dispute, in that we are going to a wetter world in our part of the world. And it has great implications for what we can produce and how we can produce it. We're also going to a warmer world in our part of the world, and that's through to 2050. And again, more heat units, more opportunity to grow a greater variety of different valuable egg products. So if those predictions are accurate, and of course, I mean, that probably can be disputed, but we need to consider what we can grow and in what quantities and for what purposes. So we've got a lot of opportunity in front of us, but we need to probably get more strategic and more deliberate. If there's any takeaway that I could leave you with, is we do have a bright future, but we've got to be strategic and we've got to be deliberate about it. So that, in a nutshell, is what I wanted to talk about. So I thank you.